Our reading from Genesis 39 ended. The Lord gave him success in everything he did. But in our 21st century world, what does success look like? Little Johnny is at primary school. We want his life not to be a failure, but a success. But what does that mean? Somewhat closer to home. How about you? As you look back, as you look forward, do you feel a success or a failure with your life? Just occasionally we hear the expression, well, God has favoured her, meaning she is successful. But what actually does it mean to be successful? We are looking at the story of Joseph this summer. Let me remind you, my first heading of the story so far. Joseph, someone who was earmarked by God to be an international ruler, to be the Prime Minister of Egypt, but he starts life off as someone who is a detested little brother of a large family. What is the context of this story in Genesis, right at the beginning of the Bible? Well, by and large, it's a mess. The world was a mess. By and large, no one wanted to recognise God as their creator, their owner, their master. By and large, no one wanted to recognise his ways as being good. By and large, no one wanted to recognise that one day we will have to give an account to him. And so back in Genesis 12, Abraham, God said through Abraham, I am going to act in such a way that changes, that reverses, that rescues this situation. Abraham, 3 promises. I'm going to give you many descendants. I'm going to give you a great place to live. And you and your descendants are going to be a great blessing to the people around you. Abraham has a son, Isaac. Isaac has 2 children, Esau and Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons. Abraham is starting to have descendants. But this is a very messed up family. Genesis 37, 2 chapters back, the first chapter of the Joseph story. Joseph has some dreams in which God reveals to him that God intends for him to be a ruler. His brothers, far from rejoicing at what God has revealed, they are deeply envious, and they set out to murder him. They would rather murder God's future king than bow down to him. His brothers decide instead to sell him to a passing band of slave traders on their way down to Egypt, who sell him in turn to Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's guard. That's Genesis 37. Genesis 38 we looked at a couple of weeks ago. Genesis 38, we wanted to find out what happened next to Joseph. But the author instead took us off into a different direction to see how Joseph's elder brother Judah fared. And if you were here then, and if you weren't, it's on the internet, if you were here then, you would hear me likening the Jeremy Kyle show to Genesis 38. A grubby story of sexual manipulation and immorality. This is a messed up family in a messed up world. But in the closing verses of Genesis 38, I don't know if you remember, we see Judah having his life turned around. In much the same way as last week we saw Zacchaeus having his life turned around. So, now we're there. Chapter 39, we are back with Joseph. Verse 1 of chapter 39, now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. Verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, we can now begin to see where this is going, can't we? The Lord was with Joseph. The Lord gave him success in everything that he did. And those phrases are repeated at the end of the chapter. This is going somewhere, isn't it? From Canaan to Egypt, to working for one of Pharaoh's officials, to being trusted by one of Pharaoh's officials. Joseph is getting there, isn't he? Joseph is becoming successful, we say. Yes, the Lord is clearly with him. My second surprise, my second heading, the surprise of success. But just be on the lookout, will you? That's not all that it seems. The surprise of success, because suddenly things start to go very, very pear-shaped indeed for Joseph. Joseph was, we are told, a good-looking boy. He had the type of body that appears on the front cover of Men's Health. That's two of us. And Mrs. Potiphar noticed Joseph. It was Joseph's character that Potiphar noticed when he promoted him from being an outside slave to an inside slave to maybe being house manager. It was Joseph's character that Potiphar noticed, but it was his body that Mrs. Potiphar noticed. And it doesn't take much imagination, does it, to work out what was happened or what might have happened. The ambiguous comments, the brushes in the corridor, the flirty comments, and then the blatant, come to bed with me. No, said Joseph. No, for a whole host of reasons, this is not a good idea. But Mrs. Potiphar was not to be put off. Day after day, we're told. Relentlessly, day after day, she pursued him. Until the final time she propositions him, and on that final time she realises that she has been rejected. How humiliating. And so she cries rape. Sometimes later, Mr. Potiphar returns from his business trip. He hears his wife's side of the story, and as a result he burns with rage against Joseph and has him thrown into an Egyptian prison. And yet, and I think this is the central point of the chapter, verse 20, Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favour in the eyes of the prison warder. So the warder put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warder paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Our writer Moses starts the chapter by stating that the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in everything that he did. Our writer Moses ends the chapter by stressing that the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in everything that he did. Hence my heading, the surprise of success. Now, what is the surprise of success in this chapter? What is the surprise to us here? Are we really surprised at Joseph's success in Potiphar's household or in prison? No, I don't think we're surprised by that at all. What are we surprised by? What is the surprise of success in this chapter? Well, surely the surprise in this chapter is that success seems to involve temptation and humiliation and wrongful conviction. That's the surprise, isn't it? We weren't expecting that to happen. If the Lord was with Joseph, if the Lord was granting him success, we wouldn't imagine that these things would come as part of the deal, would we? Joseph, righteous and upright in character, doing the right thing by resisting Mrs. Potiphar. Joseph, the one favoured by God, he ends up tempted and misunderstood and humiliated and falsely convicted. Please note my next sentence very carefully. In the same way that someone 1600 years later, who was righteous and upright in character, would end up tempted and misunderstood and humiliated and falsely convicted. That person's name, of course, is Jesus. The surprise of success means that thirdly then, maybe we need to rethink what success actually means. And let me come back to how we started this morning. What does success look like in God's eyes? Because my guess is that all the things that we naturally think of as being badges of success are completely absent in Joseph's life. As a parent, as a godparent, or a grandparent, or an aunt, or an uncle, or as a teacher, I want little Jimmy to be successful. Actually, I want to be successful. I want, at the end of my life, to think, yes, in some broad way, I haven't been a failure. And so I want little Jimmy to have, actually I want to have, people thinking well of him, people thinking well of me. Don't I? But in Genesis 39, people thought Joseph was a rapist. And yet Moses tells us that the Lord was with him and gave him success in everything that he did. And later in the New Testament, people thought Jesus was fit only for crucifixion. They thought more highly of Barabbas than they did Jesus. I want little Jimmy to have, actually I want to have some measure of financial security. Don't I? But in Genesis 39, Joseph in prison had nothing. And yet Moses tells us that the Lord was with him and gave him success in everything he did. And indeed Jesus had nothing. I want little Jimmy, I want him to be successful, I want him to be loved by someone. I want to be loved by someone. But in Genesis 39, after the rape charge, Joseph had no human being remotely interested in him. And yet Moses tells us that the Lord was with him and gave him success in everything that he did. And indeed, after Gethsemane, Jesus was deserted by everyone. If Joseph had success, and that involved neither reputation, nor security, nor even friendship, then we need to rethink what success is, don't we? Now, please will you note that I haven't done what I might have done. I might this morning, and I was tempted to do this, but I didn't, because I thought, no, this is pointless, because you know this already. I could have just produced a copy of OK, or a copy of Hello, and I could have paraded the celebrity lifestyle of sex and money and power, and said, look, this is empty. But I didn't need to do that, because we know that already, don't we? We know it already that that's empty. Although, let me tell you that our children don't know that it's empty. Very many of our children have swallowed the lie, are swallowing the lie, and are pursuing that lie. But I didn't do that this morning because actually I want to challenge something much less blatant, much more closer to home. I want to challenge my personal success indicators. Reputation and security and friendship and self-fulfillment and possibly decent health, isn't that the bottom line for most of us? Now, if we go to pieces when there is a chance of us losing our reputation, or losing our security, or losing a relationship, or losing our self-fulfillment, what does that tell me about what we think that success in life is all about? Doesn't Genesis 39 turn my thinking upside down? The surprise of success is that it involved temptation and misunderstanding and humiliation and unfairness. That causes us to rethink what success actually is. And so lastly, the marks of success, the true marks of success. What does Joseph do? I've written 3 things down. I've written down he flees, he fears, he keeps going. He flees. Let's go back to the advances of Mrs. Potiphar. I don't think we can underestimate the huge pressure that Joseph was under. Let me make, first of all, the obvious point. This was a boy in his late teens with raging hormones, and he is doubtlessly flattered by the seductive intentions of this wealthy and probably beautiful woman. How easy for him to have given in. Actually, how easy for him to justify giving in. Well, what sort of a husband is Potiphar in going off and leaving her for months on end? This woman needs me. And actually, she is my boss. She is ordering me, and I'm a slave. Surely it would be wrong for me to refuse her. And the other slaves, think how helpful I could be to them if I got on the right side of the mistress of the household. And hey, what does it matter? It's only sex. And hey, we're in Egypt. And anything goes in Egypt. And my master need never know. After all, who's going to tell him? His wife is hardly going to tell him. The other slaves will know that the mistress of the house will make their lives miserable if they squeal. No one's going to find out. And God? Does God really mind that much? Surely God won't mind. Surely God will understand the pressures that I am under. Actually, has God really ever prohibited this sort of behaviour? How easy for Joseph to have given in. But what does Joseph do? Verse 11, one day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. He flew. He ran. Joseph's success was marked by his running. Christians in past years, Christians in previous centuries, I think we've lost this perspective. Christians in past years had a little saying: it is better to die than to sin. Is that my perspective? That was Joseph's perspective. Indeed, and I think this is so telling. Verse 10, this is beforehand, and though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even to be with her. Isn't that a healthy and wise and impressive thing for him to have done? Not only fleeing sin, but fleeing situations I know will tempt me to sin. In God's book, it would seem that success is marked by fleeing. But behind that success, it is also marked by fearing. Verse 6, now Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me," but he refused. "With me in charge," he told me, "my master does not concern myself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" Who was Joseph fearful of? Well, rightly his master Potiphar, but behind that, behind his fear of Potiphar, we can see that he has a healthy fear of God. Yes, Potiphar had been good to him. Yes, Potiphar had entrusted to him. Yes, Potiphar had implicitly set boundaries. Yes, Potiphar would one day return and call him to account. But behind that, remarkably, Joseph had grasped that God had been good to him. God had entrusted to him. God had implicitly set boundaries. God would one day return and call him to account. We don't talk as much as we might about fearing God. But Joseph not only had a healthy fear of his earthly master, he had a healthy fear of his heavenly master. Success means fearing. Success means fleeing. Thirdly, success means keeping going. Just imagine for a second that it's you who are Joseph. Your brothers wanted you dead and they sold you into slavery instead. 17. The terror of being transported to a foreign country. The humiliation of being sold as a slave in one of the Egyptian slave markets. But then you work your socks off and you get somewhere and your life is really going somewhere. However, you now face this seemingly unbearable temptation, but somehow you hold it together. Somehow you don't give in. You are desperate to remain faithful to God and his ways, and then it all comes crashing down. And you're accused of being a rapist, you're thrown into prison, and you are now rock bottom. What do you do now? Let me tell you what you do now. You say, stuff it! Don't you? If this is where doing the right thing gets me, if this is what happens when you do your best to stay loyal to God and his ways, stuff it. Surely that's what you do. You ditch the God who has ditched you. And yet that is not what Joseph did. And that is not what the Lord Jesus did 1600 years later when he was hanging on a cross. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favour in the eyes of the prison warder. So the warder put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warder paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. What did Joseph do? Joseph started all over again. Joseph kept going. The success we have in Genesis 39 is a million miles away, isn't it, from what the world today calls success. This is light years away from hello or okay. It is also, dare I say, very different from what many of us want for ourselves, for our children, to be well thought of, to have friendships, to have security, to have self-fulfillment. Fear, flee, keep going. That is the way of Joseph. That is the way of Jesus. Why? Because this is the way that God uses and perfects his people, so that, back to Abraham, this is the way his people will be a blessing to others. Fear, flee, keep going. Joseph did, and he was a blessing to many others. He was a blessing to the whole of Potiphar's household. He was a blessing to the whole of the prison. And in years to come, he would be a blessing to maybe millions as he saved them from the famine. Fear, flee, keep going. That is what Jesus did. And was he a blessing to many? Absolutely, he was a blessing to many. He saved very many, billions, by taking on his shoulders their sin. And you, and me, and us. God desires that we be a blessing to many. Flee, fear, keep going. God desires that we be truly successful.